afternoon, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for being part of this WorkSafe webinar, part of our 2021 Health and Safety Month. My name's Fiona Shutt. I'm the Executive Director of Business Performance here at WorkSafe, and I'm also your host for today's webinar. And while our program of sessions is virtual, our aim of Health and Safety Month is always the same, which is to keep you informed. And this year's theme is You Learn Something New Every Day. We've got an interesting webinar here for you this afternoon, our final in this year's program, so thanks again for joining us. Our topic is the importance of health and safety representatives to business. Now, I'm lucky enough to be joined by three subject matter experts today on this panel, so let me welcome Colin Radford, Chief Executive Officer of WorkSafe Victoria.
Thanks, Fiona. Great to be here.
Thanks, Colin. We've got Mike Hagan, General Manager for Human Resources, Corporate Compliance and Health, Safety and Environment from Bosch Oceania. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you, Fiona.
And we have Henry Connor joining us also, Senior Process Safety Analyst, Regulated Industries, also at WorkSafe Victoria. So thank you for your time today, Henry, too.
No worries, Fiona.
So before we talk to our panel, I'd like to set the scene for our viewers and briefly explain the difference between a health and safety representative, an occupational health and safety officer, and a union delegate, because each has different responsibilities which work complementary to each other. Essentially, a health and safety representative is an employee of a workplace who volunteers for the additional role of a health and safety rep on top of their day job. They get elected by members of their designated work group to represent them on occupational health and safety issues. They also receive specific training and have specific powers under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. By contrast, an occupational health and safety officer is usually a management representative within the workplace, where occupational health and safety is their primary role. Union delegates, on the other hand, are a workplace union delegate is usually an employee of an organisation and not a full-time paid official of the union, and they advocate on both industrial and occupational health and safety issues. So with that opening context, I'd like to start today's chat with you, Colin, if I can, because in a stellar 30-year career working in and with the Victorian public sector, you've held many senior roles, including your current one as Chief Executive Officer of WorkSafe Victoria, and before that as the CEO of the Victorian Managed Insurance Authority, where you oversaw a major cultural and strategic transformation. But you've also actually been a health and safety representative. So tell us about that time and what you actually learnt from that experience.
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. I need to stress it was a long time ago. It was well over 30 years ago. And my original career was in journalism. So I started out as a journalist originally and then background in communications, subsequently before taking on the roles that you mentioned. And I was working at the ABC at the time in Melbourne. I was also the union delegate and for what was then known as the Australian Journalists Association. And I don't know that I actually volunteered for the role. I think someone just kind of said, "Well, you're going to do this," and I said, "Okay, sounds okay. I can do that." And what I learned through that process was that even though we worked in a newsroom, newsrooms are fairly robust environments, but not the sort of physical hazards that I'm sure that Mike or Henry will be able to talk about. From the industries that they've worked in. But even though there weren't the obvious physical hazards with large machinery or forklifts or falls from heights, there were still inherent risks in the workplace that we had to be aware of and that we had to think differently. And I think one of the things that I did learn during my time as a health and safety rep is you learn to look through a slightly different perspective. You're not always looking for fault, but you are looking for things from the point of view of, if this were to occur, the consequences could be severe. So how do we control that particular risk? Also, in those days, the ABC newsroom was co-located in the same building as the family court. So there were regularly protests and indeed bomb threats in the building. So we became very familiar with how to evacuate the building when there were bomb threats or other threats to the building that we're in, which is very challenging because it's not only was the newsroom in that building, but our studio was. And those threats could occur when people were on air or all sorts of circumstances. So we certainly learned the meaning of the term reasonably practicable, and you had to exercise judgment. I think the other thing that I would say that I learned was that employers often don't realise or recognise the importance and the insight that the HSRs can bring. So often what would happen is a decision is taken and then it's kind of, oh, we better just let the HSRs know what we're doing and check if they've got any problems. The real benefit comes with involving the HSRs in the decision-making process, because their insight, their knowledge of what's happening on the ground day to day is so critical and can really help you make not only the best decision, but avoid some potential unintended consequences down the track. So I think they were the key things I learned. The last thing I would mention before handing back to you, Fiona, is that 30 years ago when I was an HSR, we had absolutely no sort of knowledge or concept of mental health issues and mental injury. And if I reflect back on my time as a journalist and some of the things that I saw and some of the events I covered, I covered the Coode Island fire, I covered a number of serious crimes, police shootings, road trauma, those sorts of incidents. There was no support network around journalists in that day. There was no debrief, there was no counselling, there was no ability to kind of process those sorts of events. And if there was one thing that I would hope we've learned subsequently, it is that mental health and the risk of mental injury is just as profound as physical health and the risk of physical injury. And that's probably the key lesson in hindsight that I would have loved to have known back then and probably done differently back then.
Absolutely, some great context there, Colin. And staying with you, Colin, because I can imagine back when you were the HSR in the ABC newsroom, you didn't imagine being the CEO of the state's regulator and insurance scheme this time down or this time forward. So do you think it's part of your past experience in that space that has fueled your passion for the role that you now play at WorkSafe?
I don't think anyone would have imagined that back then, if I'm being honest, certainly including myself and probably those I worked with. I have reflected on this, and as you mentioned, I've also worked, I was the CEO of the VMIA before coming here. I also spent 10 years across 2 stints at the Transport Accident Commission, where I was head of marketing and road safety, and then subsequently I was on the board for 5 years. And I think what occurred is during my time working as a journalist, I saw a lot of trauma. I attended a lot of traumatic events, and thankfully I've not personally experienced that level of trauma, but I've been witness to it. And I think if I look back and think back, almost subconsciously I've been led into roles that have a very strong focus on trying to prevent trauma from occurring. So whether that was the TAC, the VMIA, or here at WorkSafe, and to supporting people who have been affected by trauma. So I don't do trauma well. I don't like blood. I don't like hospitals. I think all of that probably comes back to what I did witness at a time when I was quite young, very inexperienced, and certainly not trained or conditioned for the sorts of events that a lot of journalists back in those days had to cover. And I think what that's given me is a real sense of a determination to try to help other people avoid the experience of trauma and to support people who it affects.
Thanks, Colin. That is certainly an interesting path that has led you here. So thank you for sharing that with us. Mike, I'm going to come to you now as our second panellist who's joining us today. And Mike's got some great experience. He's highly experienced, motivated, and a versatile health, safety, environment, and health human resources senior executive with 16 years operational and strategic experience in both the private and the public sector. And indeed, Mike's initial entry point into his health and safety career was as an HSR in the UK's nuclear industry, which I would imagine would have been a very interesting role there, Mike. Mike's currently the General Manager of Human Resources at Robert Bosch Oceania. And Bosch is recognised the world over for its very engaged workplace with great attention to safety. So it seems that an important role for a health and safety representative is acting as a conduit between employees and the employer, Mike. And the key ingredient here across Bosch's diverse operations sites is really good consultation. So with that segue, Mike, can you outline for the audience what good consultation looks like and how does Bosch do it so well?
Thank you, Fiona, and thanks for the kind and generous introduction. I had to check it was me you were talking about for a moment then. Yeah, consultation. So, if we look at the legal definition of consultation, it's the act of seeking opinion or advice. And I think when we consult, it's important that we actually ask because we value the input. And, to Colin's point there, to go and ask the HSRs when the decisions have been made, that's not really consultation. And we should consult because it's a meaningful act within the organisation, not because there's a piece of legislation that mandates it, not because we've got to tick a box in an internal policy. And I've known organisations over the years who will only allow an HSR the minimum amount of training allowed under legislation. They'll begrudge them the time to actually spend working with the DWGs to fulfil their not responsibilities, but their activities. They won't involve them proactively in discussions, and then they bemoan the fact they don't get any value out of the HSRs. To me, it's a clean return on investment, and if you've got a collaborative approach to the HSRs, they're a great asset to an organisation. So at Bosch, we had an opportunity about 10 years ago to rebuild our risk management system from the ground up, really. We were changing our business model. Some manufacturing was moving. We were taking on different parts of the business. And we were also rolling our environmental functions into OHS. So it was a good chance to start from a clean slate, I guess. And there was some clear points that we made within that structure to enshrine consultation. And we made sure that in every training module, whether it be an induction on the side or the due diligence the directors carry out, that the role of consultation and proactive consultation was sacrosanct. It was front and centre. It was part of the dialogue. The second thing we done was we introduced an induction course for HSRs, or an induction training module. So once they'd completed, or sometimes before they've completed their external training, we provided additional training around things that would help them assimilate into the Bosch way of doing things. We're a German engineering company. We've got lots of processes and procedures. Lots. And we provided additional training around the role of a HSE committee, around workplace inspections, around incident investigations, and most importantly, around risk assessment. And that leads me on to the third part, and I guess it's the cornerstone of our risk management system. We have a thing that we call the risk assessment tool. It's lovingly known as the RAT. And within the risk assessment tool, the front end is a risk assessment tool. We've all seen them. But the second part of it, the data it collects then goes to a fully quantifiable risk profile for the organisation. A fantastic tool, which required every single risk assessment to be refreshed and put into the new tool. And that was heavily involved in the HSRs to the point we've hardwired them into the RAT. That doesn't mean we put a microchip into them. We're not allowed to do that. But what it means is that if there's a risk assessment being carried out and there hasn't been an HSR involved, it red flags. And then we can go to that risk assessment and we can understand why and make sure an HSR is consulted through that process. But when I talk to people about why we do consult, we consult for the three reasons we do everything in HSE. We do it because there's a moral reason, a legal reason, and an economic reason. And often when you're discussing at different levels of the organisation, you may change the running order on those items. But from a legal point of view, clearly there's legislation, there's expectations, and there's penalties. And I'm sure that you've talked about that in many of the sessions this week. From an economic point of view, and this is one that I often think is a bit of a no-brainer, the average cost of a physical injury in Victoria in 2020 was $94,000. The average cost of an ergonomic workstation is $600. Now, I'm not a financial controller, trust me on this, but that's 150 workstations, and how many injuries or claims could we prevent if we invested that? But most importantly, from the moral perspective, And even yesterday, when I was doing an inspection on the location, whenever I look at a task or I look at a risk assessment, I ask people the question, imagine your son, your daughter, your mother or your father doing that task. Right, let's do the risk assessment. And that's the most important factor to it. So consultation, absolutely fundamental and core to what we do. And we wouldn't have the robust risk management system without the support of the HSRs.
Excellent. Thank you, Mike. And such a contextual response in terms of the various angles that you consider at Bosch. And, just to pick up on the opening comment that you made about it's really the intent and the impact that you want and the value that it brings when you consult as opposed to running a process for process sake, so to speak. So thank you for emphasising that.
Thank you.
Henry, I'm going to come to you now. So Henry is a senior process safety analyst within the Regulated Industries Division here at WorkSafe Victoria. He's a chartered chemical engineer and he's worked at a number of major hazard facilities before joining us in 2016. He was one of 2 elected health and safety representatives for what is now the Regulated Industries Division, and he sat on corporate and business health and safety committees here at WorkSafe. Henry, you've played the role of a health and safety representative in the past, and clearly the role you play now has a lot of context and contact or an awareness of the role of a health and safety rep. So I'd like to know how having an employer understand the importance of a role of an HSR and the difference it makes to its effectiveness. Talk us through that and an example of how you've seen that play out.
Yeah, well, to pick up on some of Mike's points, having a framework that an established framework that employers and HSRs can operate in, and each other having an understanding of the role that they're playing and the responsibilities is really very important for having a functional relationship. So HSRs don't have duties under the Act. They rest with the employers. But HSRs do have various powers and tools at their disposal. It's also worth remembering that HSRs are volunteers. It's a voluntary position, and they're doing it because they care about their health and safety and well-being of themselves, but also their colleagues, and they're trying to make a positive contribution to the organisation. So you can see that there might be some hesitancy, or from my position, I see some employers maybe being a bit hesitant in engaging with HSRs. They see it as a bit of a burden to their organisation. Whereas you really want to flip that to see that HSRs are a fantastic resource that have an amazing understanding of how work is actually done, and the hazards and difficulties that the frontline staff are experiencing day to day. And they're just able to attack problems from a different perspective. Internally in WorkSafe, an example that I can think of is a couple of years ago, WorkSafe was going through ISO 45001 accreditation, so they were establishing an SMS for the organisation, and we were able to establish quite a functional relationship with the project team and the health and safety team who were rolling out these procedural updates. Through the health and safety committee, they were being provided to the HSRs for review and input, and we were able to take them out to our DWGs. And WorkSafe's in a great position where we've got just amazing health and safety resources internally, and so we were able to approach ergonomists and hygienists and whoever else to look at these procedures and to provide input, and we were approaching them from a very different perspective from the people in charge of the projects. They were looking to work to a timeline and to establish these procedures, and the HSRs were looking at it from we're actually going to be using these procedures. We need them to be fit for purpose and functional for what we need. And sort of through that process, the Health and Safety Committee serving a really important conduit to facilitate that consultation, and then each other sort of understanding the roles and the roles and responsibilities. We were able to get, I think, a really good outcome where we were able to have meaningful input into the procedures and make them more fit for purpose than they otherwise would have been. So, yeah.
Thanks, Henry. And a really great example when all the parties involved are sort of really engaged in the outcome and the intent behind it. So thank you for sharing that with us. The next question I am going to throw to each of you. So Mike mentioned it a little earlier in terms of the fact that injuries cost business time and money, and fewer injuries increase productivity, notwithstanding the impact on our injured workers themselves and supporting them back to return to work. So I want to really now focus on the benefits of good consultation and working effectively with your health and safety reps beyond the theory. So I'm going to ask each of you, and I'll start with you, Mike. What are some of the business benefits you've seen at Bosch in terms of really good consultation and engagement with your HSRs, and what sort of data would you have to sort of support those outcomes?
Yeah, that's a great question. And where do you begin with the benefits? From an organisational point of view, if I just talk about the ensuring we've got a safe working environment for people, the HSRs, they're 24/7. They're there when management's gone home. They really are the eyes and the ears of an organisation. And, to Henry's point, they've got a vested interest in terms of they're doing the operations and the colleagues are doing the work. So from a cultural and a model point of view, fantastic benefit. I often get asked the question, especially around budget planning time, about what is the commercial benefit to the organisation. And the thing I often ask people to reflect upon, and I speak to many European colleagues that have come to Australia from a very different system where there is no self-insurance and work covers quite an alien concept. But over the last 10 years, our claims costs have reduced by $3 million. So if I put that to, for example, if an organisation's got a 10% return, so for every $100,000 that a company generates, there's $10,000 of profit left over. And a reverse engineer in there, the $3 million. That $3 million that's remained in the organisation is the equivalent of $30 million in sales. And that gets anybody's attention. So that's the first thing I tell a new financial controller. But there are other, and I'm very aware and a little bit uncomfortable. I'm talking about dollars when behind the dollar is pain and suffering. And but I'll answer the question regarding the business aspects. And another area is, for example, attrition. How often people leave an organisation. If an organisation looks after its employees and they feel that they're being looked after and cared for, they will stay longer. Our attrition rates are quite low. They're about 2/3 of the Australian averages, and it's less than 1% turnover in the blue-collar areas. Now, that's fantastic from a point of view of culture, from engagement, but also when you consider the average cost in Australia, back to the dollars, is $21,000 to hire somebody in the organisation. So there's clear-cut economic benefits to having, a proactive and engaged OHS culture within an organisation. To me, it really is a no-brainer. Sometimes you've got to go and look for the numbers to support it, but the numbers are there. And the last thing I'll say on the numbers, and I promise I won't touch numbers again, is we're all familiar with the iceberg. We've all done the training sessions, and the iceberg that shows 11% above the water, which is the visible costs of an injury or a workplace illness. I've only talked about the top of the iceberg. I haven't talked about all the numbers that sit below there. So from a commercial point of view, it's just such a no-brainer not to have a fully functioning OHS culture and system.
Thanks, Mike. Now, Colin, over to you, and I sort of pose a similar question to you with the lens that you bring as the head of the regulator and the insurance scheme in the state. So in terms of what do you see are the business benefits of really good engagement and consultation with HSRs?
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. And I think, going to Mike's point, very much that first step is that there is an HSR. I mean, businesses that have, or organisations that have an HSR, it's usually a sign that health and safety is taken seriously. It's then how you act and what you do and how you utilise the extraordinary skills and commitment and passion of those HSRs. And I think, what we would see from WorkSafe's point of view is that a well-organised workplace with a strong OHS culture that Mike talked about, we do see improved health and wellbeing. We see more engaged employees. We see fewer injuries. And then if you look at the dollar impact, again, as Mike mentioned, we always start with the human impact, but there's an economic cost and a social cost of a workplace injury. You do see fewer claims, fewer injuries, fewer claims, a more engaged workforce, a workforce that feels more empowered, a workforce that will speak up when there are risks to health and safety, which is the best way to control them, when you've got people who know that it is safe to speak up and raise their concerns. And from our point of view as the insurer, fewer claims means lower premiums for the employers who fund our scheme. So I think it genuinely is a win-win-win. We see fewer injuries, we see the economic benefit through greater productivity and fewer claims, and for those employers who really do understand the benefits, we see much more employee engagement. And as Mike said, that leads to a great culture, lower attrition, and ultimately a safer workplace and probably a more productive, more effective and more efficient workplace.
Thanks, Colin. And Henry, you bring a different perspective to this question again. So I put it to you in terms of, given your role as a health and safety rep and the role that you now play in WorkSafe, what sort of benefits does that bring in terms of staff morale and engagement? And tell us about why that's so important.
Yeah, well, I suppose the links to morale sort of go without saying, that if you can improve engagement and empower people to sort of be able to influence their own health and safety and their workplace, and that's going to have links through to more engagement and high morale. We look for three kind of foundations for facilitating effective engagement. First one's around good representative structures, so that the employees are appropriately represented, strong consultation procedures and systems, and a solid issue resolution procedure. So people are able to raise, are consulted on issues, they're able to raise concerns, and those concerns are being addressed. They can see them being addressed and they're not hanging around. Internally in WorkSafe, when we were relocating offices from one part of Melbourne to another, members of my DWG sort of came forward and identified a hazard of accessing the building from the staff car park. There was quite a number of sort of difficulties with that, and we were able to raise that through the Health and Safety Committee and our internal structures to the Health and Safety team and our DWG management rep, and physically go through and walk through the problem with them. And we were able to see that the organisation was taking it seriously. Within a week, they'd sort of engaged the building, the facility manager, and had put in a raft of improvements. So, improved lighting, improved visibility, marked a footpath and a pedestrian crossing for employees. And that just really, I think that was a really good example of people had a concern. They felt empowered to come forward and could see that it meaningfully impacted how they complete their work, which was just a great outcome. So, yeah, it's only a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely, and a great example too, Henry. Thanks for sharing that. Colin, back to you. What does WorkSafe know from its own consultation with health and safety representatives, and how does that inform the way in WorkSafe then support them in the role that they play for employers?
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. And I think Henry touched on some of this earlier, but our consultation with HSRs shows us that employer attitudes towards HSRs are not always positive. We don't always hear the great stories like Mike's just told us about the approach that Bosch take. employers and co-workers don't always understand the HSR role. Our aim is for HSRs to be not to be kind of lurking in the shadows doing their business behind the scenes. We want them to be visible and we want them to be valued in their workplace because of the critical role that they do play. We also know that HSRs need time to do their job properly. And again, I think Mike made this point around, the proper training, the time to, not the whatever your health and safety kind of committee structure is, it's not the thing that gets tacked on, at the end of a long day. It's got to be central to your thinking. We at WorkSafe, as Henry and Fiona, you're aware, our health and safety committee, the WorkSafe Health and Safety Internal Committee, if you like, I chair that because I think it's really important that the organisation sees that this is of importance to the CEO. At our board meetings, the first item on every board agenda is health, safety and wellbeing. Above all else, the first item on every WorkSafe board agenda is always health, safety and wellbeing. Likewise, at our executive meeting, the first item of the agenda, are there any OHS issues to be aware of as the executive? So I think it's that visible recognition of the importance of having that safe work culture and then the role that HSRs can play in contributing to that. So, we want to make sure that when WorkSafe inspectors turn up to a workplace, the HSRs are not only visible, but they're given the time to talk to our inspectors. I always say to our newly minted inspectors, they say, what's the best piece of advice you can give us as a WorkSafe inspector? And my advice is always the same. The first person you speak to and the last person you speak to when you visit a workplace is the HSR, because they will know what's happening on the ground. They will know what we need to know in order for us to play our role as the regulator. And so I think how we can best support HSRs is one of the key focus areas for us as an organisation. We've just announced our new 3-year strategy, and central to our efforts to reduce workplace harm is better supporting and empowering HSRs in all workplaces.
Excellent. Great. Thanks for sharing that context from a WorkSafe perspective, Colin. And we're coming to our final panelist question for Mike and Henry, after which we'll go straight to Q&A. And there's some great questions coming through. So thank you to our audience today for being so interactive and interested in this particular topic, because it is an important one. So I'll make sure we allow enough time to get through those. Mike, I'll start with you for our final question. Can you give us an example about a time a health and safety representative came to management with an issue that the business leaders weren't necessarily aware of, and how that led to a solution that subsequently improved prevention in the workplace?
The one that jumps to the front of my mind, Fiona, is probably a quite recent one, and it was when we were putting in place the COVID safe plans. And as we all now know, that the devil really is in the detail. Mm-hmm. And what we done was when we realised COVID was a thing, we increased the frequency. We actually had a specific HSE committee with the HSRs that run every second week, just specifically on that topic. And I mentioned earlier that the HSRs are there when the management team aren't, and there was great feedback in relation to. I'm very aware I'm speaking to WorkSafe at the moment, in relation to discipline around PPE when we first had to apply the PPE, the distancing rules and regulations, and what a moving feast that was. And without the HSRs giving us real-time feedback, management couldn't have done that as a management piece, not at all. And even on the visit, I was doing an inspection yesterday. I was getting fresh feedback there in terms of, could we try this, could we do this, and what about when we return to work? And that has been, to be honest, the core of the controls that we have in place have been generated by HSRs. They know where the common touch points are. They know who picks up what. They know the production flow much more intrinsically than the middle management do. So that would be the example that jumps to the front of my mind. They've done a fantastic job.
Excellent. A really great example and a very pertinent one in the current context too, Mike, especially with COVID and the pace at which advice was changing and the time to implement as well. So thank you for that. And Henry, over to you. Could you give us an example about a time a health and safety rep brought something to the attention of management they weren't aware of and how that went towards prevention ultimately?
Yeah, I mean, the best example I can think of is going back to engineering days, and health and safety reps, frontline employees, operators are just, crucial to the completion of safety assessment, risk assessments, project reviews. Basically, need to be completely embedded in the project life cycle from the start to avoid all sorts of heartache. I can't think of a single safety assessment workshop or design review that I've sat in and the frontline staff they've been the only people in the room that actually have a particular bit of information that's crucial. A very vivid example I can think of was a 3D review that we were completing. So a new bit of kit was being installed at a manufacturing facility, and the last sort of step before starting construction was a 3D model review, and the operators just picked it apart. It was fantastic, like in a very constructive way, but they were bringing a very practical set of eyes to this problem, which up to that point had been largely driven by engineers. And they were saying things like, well, that isolation valve's 3 meters off the ground. How am I meant to access it? I was like, oh, that's a good point. And this valve spindle is blocking access, is jutting out into the path. So rotate it 90 degrees, and then that just improves access. And they're just able to just bring a different set of eyes and a different perspective to these problems. We want a diversity of views to try and make sure that all the risks are being considered and all potential control measures are being identified and reviewed for practicability. So they're just an invaluable part in so many functions.
Great. Thanks for that, Henry. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to launch straight into all the great questions that we've got queued for the panellists, and some of the really good ones in there. So first question, which I'm going to send this one to Mike, if that's okay with you, Mike. It might depend on the question itself, whether you're happy to receive it or not. Can a health and safety rep ask for an inspector to attend your workplace and inform and assist in establishing work groups and health and safety representatives?
Can a health and safety, just give me the first part of the question again, please,
Sure.
Fiona.
Can an HSR ask for an inspector, a WorkSafe inspector, to attend your workplace and inform and assist in establishing an HSR work group and their roles?
Yes, we've actually had that in the past, where WorkSafe have come in and helped us review the arrangements and the requests. So that's actually been an active case, and the HSRs and WorkSafe were instrumental in coming to an agreed outcome on that. So that's business as usual, really, those kind of interactions. Yeah, we'd encourage those dialogues.
Can I just jump in there
Absolutely,
as well?
Henry.
So WorkSafe has HSR support officers and a representation support team who sort of deal with these issues, and there's also tools available on the WorkSafe website. So hopefully, it's definitely an area that the WorkSafe tries to help out in, and to make sure everyone's aware of the duties and responsibilities, and if HSRs do need support, be able to step in and support them as required. Or HSRs and employers, like often employers aren't aware of their duties either. So so it's definitely an area that WorkSafe looks to be involved in.
Okay, great, Henry. And I'm going to ask you to remain holding the floor, Henry, because that's a really great segue to our next question, which is in a small business, the role of a health and safety rep often falls to one admin staffer in small teams as part of their job description. So given that, what online training programs are there for those of us inexperienced yet being allocated this role without the expected formal training?
Oh, that's a good question. So I suppose the point I was making earlier, and that some of the others have made, health and safety reps don't have any duties, and we do see this quite a bit where there's almost an expectation that okay, yeah, you're the health and safety rep, so you have to show up to these meetings and you have to do this and you have to sign off on these things we give you, and yeah, that's obviously not the intent of the role, and it's really again, it's a box ticking exercise. In terms of online courses, I'm not actually sure. I completed my training through I think it was a week-long or 3-day-long HSR course with Trades Hall, which was fantastic. They provided all sorts of great resources and support to quite a diverse group of HSRs that attended there. I'm not sure about the best virtual training or things like that, but I'd say the WorkSafe website hopefully will be able to point you in the right direction, or is a good starting place. And then obviously, if you do have concerns so employers do need to provide training if to all HSRs, and if that is not being allowed, then again, that's an area that you can call WorkSafe, and our inspectors can come in and support sort of the provision of that training. So,
great, thanks, Henry. The next question, Colin, is for you.
Yes.
What strategies is WorkSafe putting into place to best educate employers, as a number of them are small to medium-sized businesses, to better engage and understand what an HSR does and their role?
Yeah, equally a great question. It is a real focus area for us, as I mentioned briefly just before, in our new 3-year strategy, because the reality is there's more than 250,000 workplaces across Victoria. We as WorkSafe can't be in all of them. We probably do, in a normal year, a non-pandemic year, we probably do 45 to 50,000 visits a year. So we do get to a good number of those workplaces, and we target our efforts on those industries where we believe there's the greatest risk of harm. So if you're a smaller enterprise, a small business, or you're wanting to know how do we get the structures in place? How do we get a good HSR or HSRs and networks? We can certainly assist with that. As Henry said, we do a lot of work in that space. We've got an HSR support unit, and that can work with HSRs and employers. Those proactive employers that recognise the benefit and the importance of having good, well-supported HSRs, as both Mike and Henry have spoken about. We're very keen to work with them to support them to get that in place, just as we're keen to work with the HSRs to ensure that they've got the training and support that they need. I think the other area, and this was actually an idea that came up on one of the other webinars that you and I were both involved in earlier today, Fiona. Part of WorkSafe's role is in education and in behavioural change, public education campaigns around promoting safe work practices and health and safety more broadly. One of the ideas and one of the suggestions was, would we run a campaign around the importance of HSRs and the importance of working with workplaces to get good HSR structures and support in place. And it's certainly something that I'll be talking to our marketing and communications team about, because I think there is real benefit. It's one thing for me as a CEO to say we want HSRs to be front and centre, and we want them to be visible, and we want them to be recognised. I think there is a role for us as WorkSafe to play in helping make that a reality.
Excellent. Great. Thanks, Colin. What can a health and safety rep do if their employer is refusing to consult with them?
So there's an issue resolution procedure that's defined in the Act and Regs, or the Act, I think. If organisations don't have an agreed issue resolution procedure in place, then it defaults to the procedure in the Act. Basically, employers have a duty to consult with health and safety reps, and if there's no health and safety rep with employees, so essentially they have to. Health and safety reps have powers, so they can issue provisional improvement notices if there's an escalation process, so you do need to follow the issue resolution process that's outlined in the Act. But essentially, if you're not being consulted and you're raising health and safety concerns and they're not being addressed, then you can issue a provisional improvement notice. You can also approach WorkSafe, to come in and try and so raise a service request through advisory, and then WorkSafe inspector can come out and look at the issue. Obviously, we prefer that issues are resolved. Everyone prefers that issues are resolved prior to enforcement action or provisional improvement notices being issued, but sometimes that's not possible. So there are tools and mechanisms. There's a process defined in the regulatory framework that can be followed, and then as a not a last resort, but the option also is there to contact WorkSafe if things really aren't moving and you need that external third party to come in and move things along.
Great, thanks, Henry. And there's also some great resources on the WorkSafe website in relation to that specific question, if any of our audience want more information around that. We're at time, but such a great conversation to be had today. Thank you for all the terrific responses to the questions, for everybody who's been tuning in and joining us for this panel conversation today. As I mentioned, the WorkSafe website has a heap of great resources, guides and tools. If there's anybody on today's webinar who's seeking more information about today's topic or any other health and safety related information. And WorkSafe is really focused on ensuring Victorian workers are supported to get through these tough times. Health and safety reps are a really terrific resource in any organisation. Their support can be very valuable to business in a whole range of ways, as we've seen this afternoon. So with that wraps up our webinar today and our webinars for Health and Safety Month. So I just want to say thanks again to our panellists today, Mike, Henry and Colin. Thank you for joining us. We hope you found this a really interesting and informative webinar. It will also be available online in a couple of weeks' time should you want to go back and revisit it. So thank you again for joining us today. We hope you found it informative and insightful, and take care. We hope to see you again soon.